All right, so finally we're going to start the read through for the Beatific story that I mentioned before. It was not addressed to me, it was not written to me, and I read this almost 20 years ago. This was a letter written to some other person who owned a website that dealt with some of the issues that we talk about over at Guerrero.com as well. But anyways, I don't want to editorialize too much. I'm going to read part one. It's going to be half of it. It's going to be the first long letter, and then the series of follow-up letters I'm going to read in part two, and I'll give my editorializing thoughts in part three. And as a last side note, this isn't even rated R, it's rated X, although I guess you could assume that about most of the stuff that is published here. So that's fair warning. Bill, I stumbled across your website about 6 years ago, a fortuitous event for me. I've studied your site, read some of the personal stories, and I have sat down to write to you about a half a dozen times about experiences I had with a friend of mine almost 30 years ago. Each time I have started writing, I have been overwhelmed by memories, both joyous and painful, but this time I think I will just go ahead and write. I am 47 years old. I have been married for 21 years. I am 6'4", 225 pounds, blonde hair, blue eyes, and in relatively good shape. I grew up in a small population 1,300 town in a big southern state. When I was 17 in 1971, a boy moved to town from my state's biggest city. I am sure this was quite a culture shock for him. He was 16 years old, a freshman, and his name was Stephen. I was a sophomore, and I played football. Stephen came to tryouts and made the varsity team as a freshman. He was a pretty good athlete. He and I became friends pretty quickly after he came to town, since we shared a love of football and hunting, primarily bird hunting. My grandfather owned about 750 acres of land outside of town, which had been a working cattle ranch until the mid-60s. The ranch had a small hunting cabin on it, which we kids used when we were camping out and hunting. Dove hunting season began in late September. I invited Stephen one day to go hunting the following Friday afternoon. The first weekend of dove season was the last free Friday we would have because the first Friday football game would be played the following week. I explained we could hunt on my grandfather's land, and if he wanted, stay at the hunting house overnight. He thought that was a great idea, and since I was 17 and had my driver's license, I could drive us. Friday came, and after school and football practice, we loaded up and drove the 20 miles outside of town to my grandfather's old place. We walked the fields for about 2 hours, and both of us managed to kill our limit. We then went back to the cabin, cleaned the birds, and packed them in ice in a cooler. Afterwards, we cleaned up in a creek that ran behind the cabin. No indoor plumbing, outhouse only. It was a hot September evening, and we both stripped down to bathe in the cool water. After we cleaned up, we dressed and we went back to the cabin and made a quick dinner of some of the dove wrapped in bacon and cooked over an open fire. I had done this 100 times. After dinner, we sat around, shooting the breeze, looking at the stars, talking about girls, football, school, and life in general. I'd gotten my older brother to get us a 6-pack of beer, and we had iced that down earlier in the afternoon. We drank the 6-pack and prepared to go to bed around 11 p.m. or midnight. The cabin had a small camp bed, and we both had sleeping bags as well as our knapsacks. We got ready for bed, which consisted of stripping to our briefs. We decided after some discussion that it would be all right for both of us to sleep in the same bed, since it would be more comfortable than sleeping on the floor in sleeping bags. We continued to talk, and the conversation turned to sex. Specifically, Stephen asked me if I masturbated. I answered yes, I did. To say that I was sexually naive would be a gross understatement. My experience with girls had been limited, and I was not what you would call sexually bold. That said, Stephen then asked if I had ever jacked off with another guy. Well, no, I hadn't. It was at this point he said he wanted to show me something that he and a buddy of his from the big city used to do. There was a couple of pillows on the camp bed, and he stacked them one on top of the other and told me to lie back on them. I leaned back on them not fully reclining, and he knelt on the bed in front of me. Then he said I would need to get rid of my underwear. I hesitated, and he reached up and hooked his fingers around the waistband and stripped them off of me in a single motion. My penis was tumescent, but not fully erect. Stephen reached out and gently but firmly began to fondle me. My dick instantly sprang to attention like a good little soldier. Stephen stood up, and I could see he had a hard-on already, and he slid his own briefs to the floor and stepped out of them. Stephen was pretty well built, about 6'2", 180 pounds, with brown hair and brown eyes, and man, was he a handsome kid. His body was smooth except for a little trail of hair that went from just under his belly button to his crotch. He then knelt on the bed again and scooted his body up to mine until our balls were touching. At this point, my heart was pounding so hard in my chest I was sure he could hear it. The blood was thrumming loudly in my ears, and I was practically hyperventilating. Stephen gently told me to calm down and that I was going to like this. I took a deep breath, and that helped marginally. Stephen then reached down beside the bed into his knapsack and produced a small jar of Vaseline. He opened it, got out a dollop, and rubbed it into the palm of his hands. It was at this point that I realized he had planned this out ahead of time. Then, with his left hand, he grasped both our dicks together at the base, and with his right hand stroked upward from the bases of the heads of our dicks. It was like I had been electrified. I could not believe the indescribable feeling of his hand on our cocks together. He stroked once, twice, and then as powerfully as I had ever come. The first ejaculate hit me directly under the chin. The second landed splat on my chest. My head was literally spinning because I had never felt this kind of pleasure solo. Stephen smiled and said the first time he and his buddy had done this, he had done the same thing and had come almost instantaneously. He told me we could give it another few minutes and then we really could have some fun. He hadn't come when I had, and he was still erect. He held our cocks together and began to stroke them again. It didn't take long before I was hard again. As he stroked us together, he leaned his head forward and began to nipple and lick at my nipples. As his rhythm increased, he began to lean into me more until finally his hands went around my hips and we were thrusting against each other, greasy with the Vaseline. The friction increased, and then I put my hand between us to touch his cock. He groaned and thrust hard into my hand, and I reached over and grasped my own penis to hold against his. He bucked, and he began to gasp little breaths, and I could literally feel his dick prepare to come. I put my free hand on his ass, and as he pushed hard into my hand, he came noisily. The feeling of his ejaculation and his little yelps of ecstasy set me off just a little behind him, and once again I thought I would go crazy with the pleasure. We were pretty well wet with semen from our chests to our bellies, and he relaxed onto my chest, and I held him closely for a long time. After a while, he pushed up slightly and looked at me. So he said, "Did you like that little game?" I told him it was without a doubt the best thing I had ever felt. In fact, I said, my heart was still pounding. We got up and washed ourselves from a bucket of water we had brought up from the creek. We got back into the bed, and Stephen asked if I would like to get on top, and we could do it again. This sounded to me like a wonderful idea, so I got the Vaseline and painted both of our cocks with it, and then holding him close to me, we began again. This time we played it for all we could, wrestling closely together, then moving apart and fondling one another, moving closer together with our legs entwined, both our hands grasping, and stroking our dicks until finally we came, almost simultaneously, while sitting facing one another. I collapsed into Stephen, and then I kissed him full on the lips, my tongue curious for his, and he returned the kiss urgent and hot. We cleaned up again and lay down beside each other, and I quickly fell into a deep sleep. I woke up the next morning, and Stephen had spooned against my back with his hand over my hip, lying lightly on my penis. I could feel against my back that he had an erection. When we were both fully awake, we went outside and both took that delicious first piss of the morning, and went back inside to take care of our morning erections. Later that morning, as we prepared to go back home, Stephen told me he had been planning something like this for a while and was happy I'd been willing to do this with him. The trips out to my grandfather's hunting cabin became a weekend tradition for us that September until about March the next year. We spent our weeks going to school, practicing football in the afternoons, playing football on Friday nights, and spending Saturdays out hunting. One time I brought with us a big bottle of baby oil, and we slid and slipped against one another like a couple of crazy otters. All of our experiences were with frottage, as you call it, because I don't think either of us had even heard of anal sex. Sometimes we had little wrestling matches, sometimes we were gentler, and sometimes we were extremely physical. It was all good, and I never tired at looking at Stephen's face as he was about to come. He would get that most beatific look, his eyelids fluttering slightly as he gasped and made little noises. That, in and of itself, was enough to get me off big time. Sometime around Thanksgiving, as I recall, I told Stephen I thought that I loved him. He admitted that he thought he loved me too. I have to admit, although I was conflicted about the nature of our relationship, I was over the moon. In the spring of 1972, early March, in spring practice, Stephen sprained his ankle badly and had to convalesce at home for a couple of days. I remember him telling me the orthopedist had told him it would have been better had he broken it. He was going to have to miss a couple days of school until the worst of the swelling had diminished, and then he would be able to use crutches. I volunteered to bring him his schoolwork for the missed days. I took the assignments over to him on a Saturday. His parents were out, and we sat around talking and marveling at the size of his ankle under the bandage. Stephen said that it felt much better, and he thought he would be able to make it back to school on Monday. Then he told me I could do something for him that would make him feel a whole lot better, although it would not do much for his ankle. I knew just what he meant. He pointed out that both his parents were out. His dad was at work, and his mom was shopping, and he didn't expect them home anytime soon. His dad was a retired Air Force colonel who owned a small business, and he often worked Saturdays. I helped back to his bedroom, closed and locked the door, and assisted him with sitting on the bed. I slowly removed his clothes, careful when I pulled his pants leg over his injured ankle. After he was naked, I took off my clothes. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, and I slowly laid him down. I started out by kissing him, then moved slowly down his neck to his chest and nipples, down his belly, and then to his cock. He was hard as a rock, and I took him fully into my mouth, and he pushed up slightly on his elbows while I worked on his dick. After several minutes, he reached down and grasped my head and pulled me up to him and kissed me. I slid slowly back fully up his body, and we began to wrestle gently against each other. Suddenly, someone burst through the locked door. I looked up, and I saw that it was Stephen's father. I jumped up, and the colonel began yelling at Stephen, calling him a little faggot, and that he should, and how he should kick his ass, and how could he do this, etc., etc. I was embarrassed by my nakedness and a bit intimidated by the colonel. He was a pretty big guy, and he had definitely blown a gasket. After a minute, I jumped in and said I didn't think that this was Stephen's fault, and I told him we hadn't done anything wrong. At this point, the colonel backhanded me. I had never believed in the old saying, seeing stars when you've been hit hard, but I did literally see stars, and the next thing to hit the floor was my ass. I wasn't knocked out or anything, and at this juncture, I was ready to fight. I leapt to my feet to confront this crazy bastard, and just as quickly, Stephen stumbled up between us, begging his father not to hit me. His father began berating him again, and then turned to me and said, "It's not like this is the first time Stevie's been involved in something like this." He grabbed my shirt and jeans off the bed, threw them onto my chest, and told me to take my shit and get out of his house. I told him I was worried about Stephen, and he told me that Stephen would be fine, and if I didn't get my ass out of his house, he would call the police. I looked at Stephen, and he asked me to go. I dressed quickly and left, realizing about halfway home I didn't have any underwear on. My head was spinning, and I noticed in the rearview mirror my mouth was bleeding, and the teeth in the left side of my mouth felt loose. I ended up having a pretty good bruise on my face too. I went home in a panic. The next day I called Stephen, but his mother answered and told me he did not need to talk to me and not to call again. But I did the next day after school when he didn't show up. Again, his mom said Stephen did not need to talk to me, and if I called again, she would talk to my parents. Long story short, Stephen and his mom moved back to the big city they'd come from. He never returned to school at all, and everyone wondered why he had moved back. It began to dawn on me that the reason they moved to my hometown was because something similar had happened before with Stephen. Worst of all, I didn't know what to do. I felt like someone had kicked me in the stomach, and the feeling wouldn't go away. The kicker to this whole deal was that the colonel did tell my father about what he had seen sometime later. My father confronted me with this and asked me if it was true. I admitted that it was, and my dad told me how disappointed he was in me. I have to admit at that time, I didn't get it, and I told my father so. Here I was, feeling like someone had killed my best friend, and my dad was disappointed in me. What about poor Stephen? If his dad had been willing to belt me like he had, how could I hope that he would spare Stephen? I was almost frantic with grief. My dad never told my mom, and he never brought it up to me again. Although, until the day he died, I thought it was something neither of us ever got over. I have to tell you, for the next 3 to 4 years, I was bereft. It truly felt like someone had dredged my heart out of my chest. I never heard from Stephen again, and that was 30 years ago. I played one more year of football my junior year, but not my senior year. I thought it had lost its appeal to me, but the truth of the matter was I was adrift and deeply sad, and I couldn't tell anyone why. I never again had a relationship with a guy like the one I had with Stephen. I was never as bold as he was, especially around other guys. Early in my sophomore year in college, I finally decided I was going to have to get on with my life, or this thing would drive me crazy. In the second half of my sophomore year, I met the young woman I would marry, and I fell in love with her. However, there has always been a different quality to the love I feel for her and the love I felt for Stephen. Not better or worse, just different. Perhaps it's because at one time I was obsessed with getting another chance, or perhaps it's unrequited lust, or perhaps it's because I just felt cheated out of something special, and I was never able to get it back. Whatever it was, I finally did reach a compromise with myself about 25 years ago, and since that time, while the gaping hole never filled up, the edges healed. No one has ever known this story except for Stephen, our fathers, and me. I have never talked about it with another living person, and in looking back over this whole letter, I should say thanks, in case you read it, for listening to my long and boring story. It honestly feels good to have finally had my say about it. I have to say, I am glad there are men out there who aren't afraid to step up to the plate and say they enjoy this special kind of physical relationship, whether they are straight, gay, or whatever. I know sometimes that I wish I had taken a different course, but no regret. My life is good and full. Thanks for listening. So that concludes, I guess, what we're calling part 1. Tomorrow or so we'll do part 2, and then I'll give my thoughts, I guess, in part 3. So that is it.